My name is Tanya Renee Holloway, and I want to tell you about the year I almost lost everything I had spent a decade building, all because of a woman named Brianna Celeste Okafor who decided, for reasons I still don't fully understand, that she wanted to destroy me. I grew up in Opelika, Florida, a small city just north of Miami that most people drive through without ever stopping. My grandmother, Mama, Dorothy Mae Holloway, raised me in a yellow house on a dead-end street with a mango tree in the backyard and a screen porch where she'd sit every evening listening to gospel radio. She was the kind of woman who believed that how you carry yourself in hard times tells people everything they need to know about who you are. She said it so often it became a kind of scripture in her house. Carry yourself with dignity. Don't give nobody the satisfaction of watching you fall apart. I didn't know how much I would need those words until I found myself sitting in a parking lot in Homestead, Florida, crying into a fast food bag at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. I had worked for Palmetto South Financial Services for 9 years. 9 years of getting in early and staying late. 9 years of learning every system, building every client relationship from scratch, and watching the company grow from a mid-sized regional firm into something that had real reach across the southeastern United States. I started as an entry-level client services associate making barely enough to cover my rent and car note, and by the time all of this happened, I was a senior portfolio compliance manager overseeing a team of 7 people and managing audit relationships with some of our most significant institutional clients. I had a corner office. Not the biggest one, but a corner office nonetheless, with a view of a parking structure that I genuinely loved because it meant I had made it somewhere. It wasn't the view that mattered. It was what the view represented. My mother, Rochelle, had worked retail her whole adult life. My father, Darnell, drove for a logistics company until his knees gave out, and then he did dispatching. They were hardworking, honest, loving people who did everything right and still ended up exhausted. I wanted something different not because I thought I was better than them, but because I had watched them sacrifice so much, and I didn't want their sacrifice to be wasted. Everything I did at Palmetto South I did with them in mind, with Mama in mind, with that yellow house and that mango tree and that screen porch as my compass. Brianna Okafor joined our department 18 months before any of this started. She came over from a competitor firm in Orlando with a polished resume and an even more polished way of presenting herself. She was charming, quick, good at making people feel seen in that particular way that very strategic people sometimes are. Our department director, a man named Gerald Bout, liked her immediately. Gerald was a decent enough manager, but he was also someone who responded very well to people who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his instincts, and Brianna had clearly identified this within her first 2 weeks. I didn't dislike Brianna at first. I want to be honest about that because it matters to the story. I was professional with her, showed her around, answered her questions, introduced her to the relevant contacts in compliance and audit. I treated her the way I would have wanted to be treated when I was new. There was a moment, maybe 2 months after she arrived, where she sat in my office doorway after everyone else had gone home and talked to me for almost an hour about how intimidating the work felt and how much she admired what I had built in my role. I felt genuinely warm toward her in that moment. I remember thinking she might become someone I could trust. The shift happened gradually the way those things usually do. I started noticing that in department meetings, ideas I had raised in passing conversations with Brianna would surface again as her own suggestions, presented with context and language that stripped away any trace of where they had originated. The first time it happened, I thought I was being oversensitive. The second time I made a mental note. By the 4th or 5th time, I understood what was happening. She was collecting things from me like someone going through a market, picking up pieces and putting them in a basket, and then presenting the basket as her own harvest. I started being more careful about what I shared with her. I documented my own work more deliberately, started timestamping emails to myself with project ideas, started keeping a running notes file on my work computer that logged the origination of every significant recommendation or initiative I was developing. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Kezia Fontaine, who had been with me for 3 years and understood the department better than most of the senior staff, noticed the shift in my behavior and asked me about it one afternoon. I told her I was just being more organized. She gave me a look that told me she already understood more than I had said. The real trouble started when Gerald announced that the company was restructuring the compliance division and creating a new director of regional compliance role that would sit above my current position. It was the role I had been working toward. Privately, more than one person in senior leadership had told me over the years that when such a role was created, I would be the natural candidate. I wasn't naive enough to take that as a promise, but I had worked with those words in the back of my mind for years, letting them motivate me through the long nights and the difficult audits and the moments when the politics of the office wore me down. Brianna threw her name in for the position within 48 hours of the announcement. I was not surprised. What I was not prepared for was what came next. The first indication that something was wrong came from a colleague named Marcus Webb, who worked in the adjacent risk management team and had been a friend of mine since my third year at the company. Marcus stopped by my office one afternoon with the energy of a man who had been debating whether to say something for several days and had finally made up his mind. He closed the door, which he had never done before, and told me that he had overheard a conversation between Brianna and two other colleagues in which she had said some things about me that were, in his words, not good. He was uncomfortable giving me specifics, but what he conveyed was enough. She had been telling people that my work performance had been declining, that I had been making errors in client reporting that were being quietly cleaned up before they became formal issues, and that there was concern at the leadership level about. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said very calmly, "Thank you, Marcus." He nodded and left, and I turned my chair toward the parking structure, and I breathed for a long time. None of what she was saying was true. My performance reviews for the past 4 years had been exemplary. My audit relationships were strong. My error rate was below the department standard. I had the documentation to prove all of it. But I also understood that the truth being on my side was not the same as the truth being heard. I had been in enough professional environments to know that a lie, told confidently and consistently to the right people, can become the dominant narrative long before the person being lied about even realizes the story has been written. Over the following weeks, I began to piece together the shape of what Brianna was doing. It was not random. It was a campaign, and it was targeted with a precision that told me she had been planning it for some time. She had been speaking to Gerald privately and regularly, positioning herself as someone who was concerned about the team and specifically about what she characterized as inconsistencies in my management. She had cultivated a relationship with one of the newer hires on my team, a young man named Deshaun Priestley, who was eager to please and perhaps did not yet understand that not everyone who offers mentorship has clean motivations. She was creating a network of influence, and I was the territory she was trying to claim. I made myself very still. This is something Mama taught me without ever meaning to, just by the way she existed in the world. When things got difficult, she got quieter and more deliberate, not louder and more reactive. I thought about her, and I got quiet. I started documenting everything. I saved emails. I kept records of every meeting with timestamps and topics. I noted when certain conversations happened and who was present. I created a folder on my personal hard drive labeled simply Record, and I added to it every single day. The hostile HR complaint came on a Thursday in March. I was called into Gerald's office that morning and informed that a formal complaint had been filed against me by an unnamed party, though the thinly concealed procedural language made the source clear enough, alleging that I had created a hostile and exclusionary work environment through what was described as targeted microaggressions, undermining behavior, and the deliberate withholding of professional development opportunities from certain junior members of my team. The specificity of the language suggested someone had thought very carefully about which categories would be most damaging and least disprovable. I remember the way Gerald looked at me across his desk. He was not unkind, but he was not quite meeting my eyes either, and I understood in that moment that the narrative had already done some of its work. He said all the right things about how this was simply a process and didn't represent any presumption of fault, but his discomfort told me something different. The complaint had already changed the way he was seeing me, even if only slightly, even if he would have denied it. I was placed on a 45-day administrative review while HR investigated. I kept my access to my systems and my office and my team, but I was asked not to take on any new client-facing work during that period, which was, of course, exactly the kind of professional suspension that would look terrible in the context of the director interview process that was quietly moving forward without me. My mother cried when I told her. My father got very quiet, which was always worse than crying. Kezia, when I told her in a private conversation outside the office one morning, pressed her lips together and said she had been afraid this was coming. She did not say it in a way that felt like an accusation. She said it the way someone says it when they have been watching something happen and have been dreading the moment when it becomes undeniable. I hired an employment attorney. Her name was Camille Ashby Norris, a woman out of Miami who had 20 years of experience and the particular calm of someone who had seen every version of this story before. She reviewed everything I gave her and told me that my documentation was unusually thorough for someone who had not been formally advised to keep records. I told her I had a grandmother who believed in carrying yourself with dignity, and that dignity, for me, had always included being prepared. Camille smiled at that in a way that told me she liked me and thought I had a real case. We built the timeline together. What it showed was clear. Every major accusation in the complaint corresponded directly to a period when I had been the primary competition for the director position. The deteriorating performance narrative had not come from any formal review or documented incident. It had come exclusively from informal conversations Brianna had been having with select colleagues, conversations that worked backward from the conclusion rather than forward from any evidence. The microaggression complaint was built almost entirely on anonymous testimony that, when examined carefully, could only have originated from a very small number of people, at least one of whom was known to have a close social relationship with Brianna outside of work. Camille advised me to continue being thorough, continue being professional, continue doing my job at the highest possible level, and to say as little as possible to anyone at the company who is not in my immediate trusted circle. She told me the record would matter more than anything I said in the moment. I went back to being quiet and deliberate. I went back to adding to the folder I had labeled record. What I did not know, and what changed everything, was that Brianna had been conducting her campaign, not just in person but in writing. Deshawn came to me on a Wednesday evening in April. I was the last one on the floor, or so I thought, and I was about to shut down my computer when he appeared in my doorway with the expression of a young man who had made a decision he wasn't sure was the right one but had made it anyway and was going to see it through. He told me he needed to tell me something and that he wanted me to know it was not easy for him to do it. He sat down, and he told me that over the past several months, Brianna had been communicating with him through a personal messaging app outside of company channels, coaching him on what to say in conversations with Gerald and HR, instructing him specifically on how to frame interactions with me in ways that would support the narrative she was constructing. She had been, in his words, directing everything. He had initially felt flattered by her attention and mentorship and had not understood the full context of what he was participating in. It was only when he saw the 45-day review announced, when he saw the concrete damage being done, that he understood he had been used as an instrument. He handed me printouts of the messages. He had taken screenshots and printed them at home. I read them carefully, and then I set them on my desk and I looked at this young man who was clearly terrified about what he had done and what it might mean for him, and I said, "Deshawn, thank you. I mean that." He nodded and he left, and I sat in my corner office with the view of the parking structure, and I breathed for a long time. I called Camille from my car that night. The messages were extensive. They went back over 4 months. They were detailed, specific, and unambiguous in their intent. Brianna had not been reporting concerns. She had been engineering a narrative. She had coached Deshawn on exact phrases to use. She had given him a framework for interpreting my normal management behaviors as hostile or exclusionary. She had told him explicitly that if the complaint gained traction, there would be opportunities for him in the organizational restructuring that followed. She had referenced Gerald by name and speculated about his likely responses to various pieces of information. She had described me in language that was, to use the technical term Camille used, defamatory. What she had not anticipated was that Deshawn had a conscience. What she had not anticipated was that a young man she had treated as a pawn had a mother at home in Tallahassee who had raised him to understand that how you treat people when they have no power to hurt you says everything about who you are, and that he could not continue to be part of something that he knew was wrong without that weight becoming unbearable. Camille moved quickly. She drafted a formal letter to Palmetto South's general counsel that evening, attaching photographs of the printed messages and a preliminary analysis of how they intersected with the timeline of the complaint against me. She sent it the next morning with a cover note that was, by Camille's standards, quite blunt. The letter suggested that the company might want to take a careful look at the materials before the administrative review produced any findings that would be difficult to walk back. The response from the company was fast enough to tell me that General Counsel understood immediately what they were looking at. Within 6 business days, the administrative review was quietly closed with a formal determination that the complaint lacked substantiation. I received written confirmation of that determination, which Camille had insisted upon and which the company's lawyers agreed to without much negotiation. Gerald called me into his office and delivered this news with the particular discomfort of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time clearly, that he had been managed by someone he trusted and that his management of me during this period had not been his finest work. He did not apologize in so many words, but the conversation had the texture of an apology, and I accepted it in that spirit because I needed to keep working with him and because he was not, at his core, a bad person. Brianna's tenure at Palmetto South ended 11 days after the messages leaked into the formal proceedings. The company's general counsel handled it through a separation agreement whose specific terms I was not privy to, but the outcome was visible and definitive. She was gone. Her things were cleared from her office on a Friday afternoon. I made a point of being elsewhere in the building when that happened because I had no desire to witness it and no desire to be witnessed witnessing it. There was a moment, a few days after it was all formally resolved, when I was sitting on my mother's porch in the early evening. Not the porch of my childhood home, Mama Dot's porch, but my mother's new house in Miramar where Shed moved 2 years ago, and Rochelle brought me a glass of sweet tea and sat beside me and asked me how I was really doing. Not professionally. Really doing. I thought about the parking lot in Homestead. I thought about crying into that fast food bag. I thought about the 45 days of walking into an office where I could feel the story about me was being told in rooms I wasn't in, where I could see in the slightly different way people met my eyes that something had shifted, that I had been touched by allegation in a way that even a clean resolution couldn't entirely undo. I thought about Marcus Webb coming to close my office door. I thought about Kezia's face when I told her. I thought about calling Camille from a parking garage at 9:30 at night, sitting in my car in the dark with my hands on the steering wheel. I said, "Mama, I'm tired, but I'm okay." She put her hand over mine and didn't say anything for a while. The evening was warm the way Florida evenings are, that thick, slow warmth that settles in after the sun goes down but doesn't really leave, and somewhere a few streets over someone was playing music. I told her I had learned something. Not a comfortable lesson, not the kind of lesson anyone would choose, but a real one. I had learned that the most important thing you can do when someone decides to come for you is to make sure that the truth has a home, that it's written down somewhere, that it has timestamps and context and a clear trail. People can dismiss what you say. They can reframe what they observe. They can manufacture witnesses and build narratives, and, if they are skilled and patient, they can make the people around you see something that isn't there. But they cannot manufacture documentation that doesn't exist. They cannot invent a record that you built methodically before they even understood what you were doing. And sometimes, if you are fortunate, the person they chose to use against you turns out to have more integrity than. Deshawn was not fired. I want to say that clearly, because I know some people hearing this might wonder. He had been manipulated by someone older and more experienced who had identified his ambition and his desire to be mentored and had exploited both of those things cynically and deliberately. He was young. He had come to me when it mattered. Camille had noted in her letter to General Counsel that he was a cooperating witness and that any action against him would be viewed as retaliatory, but I would have made the same case regardless of the legal posture. He stayed. He moved to a different team within the company, which I think was the right call for everyone, and last I heard, he was doing well. The Director of Regional Compliance role was filled 4 months after everything concluded. I was offered the position. I took it. My office now has a real window, not the parking structure but an actual view of the sky and, on clear days, a thin line of blue on the horizon that might be water or might just be the particular way light falls in this part of Florida. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that I can see it from where I sit every morning when I come in early and spread my work out and begin the day. Mama passed the year before all of this happened. She did not know about Brianna or the complaint or any of it. Some days I am grateful for that, and some days I wish she had been here to see how it ended, because I think she would have been quietly, thoroughly pleased. She would have sat on that screen porch with her gospel radio and said something short and precise that would have contained the whole meaning of the experience in about 12 words, and then she would have asked if I wanted sweet tea, and that would have been the end of the discussion. I think what she would have said is what she always said, that how you carry yourself in hard times tells people everything they need to know about who you are. I carried myself. The record told the truth. And in the end, the truth was enough.